It's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, November 2nd. We're coming to you a day early this week to talk about one of the biggest stories happening in the state right now. Teachers at Portland Public Schools are on strike for the first time in history. It's day 2 of the strike, and it's turning political. School officials have started calling on politicians to help end the dispute, but Democratic lawmakers are pushing back on the idea of a legislative fix. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
I'm OPB Education reporter Natalie Pate.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Natalie, let's start with you. This strike is happening after almost a year of negotiations between the teachers union and the school district without a resolution. You were out at the picket lines yesterday. What did you hear from teachers and students?
Yeah, educators are calling for several things. They want higher cost of living increases, firmer class size limits, more planning time, less standardized testing, other things too. And yesterday, I heard a lot about the building concerns in particular. Teachers were talking to me about, holes in the ceilings or tiles falling off. One teacher, Brittany Doris at Capitol Hill Elementary, said that she's in charge of about 34 fifth graders. And it's been, 80 degrees in her classroom recently, which makes it harder for her kids to learn. And they just need more support in general, especially for kids who need more help. So here's a clip of her talking about that more.
We have students with disabilities who aren't getting served because our SPED team is so overworked. We have too few adults for too many kids with some really big needs. I am trying to teach in that 34 students an age range or a academic range of first grade to about sixth grade, right? Trying to teach those who need pushing and those who need catching up. And it is me by myself all day.
And aside from teachers, you've also got, parents and classified staff and community members who are concerned about this. And they were taking part in the strike yesterday as well. Students I talked to on the picket line said that they feel like the teachers deserve what they're asking for. And one thing that really kind of stood out to me, I was talking with one fifth grader, and when I asked her what she wanted people to know, she emphasized that she didn't want students to feel like it was their fault that the strike was happening. And I don't know, that one really stuck with me.
Okay, interesting. Could you remind us what the gap is right now between the union, the Portland Association of Teachers, between what they're asking for and what the district, the Portland Public Schools administrators are offering?
Mm-hmm. The district estimates that there's a gap of about $228 million between the PPS and the Pate proposals that would span over the course of 3 years. It is important to note that that estimate does not include costs that it would take in order to finalize the class size cap that the union's asking for or address any building modifications that might be required. So it could be tens of millions of dollars more. Also of note, the union claims that the district is sharing budget forecasts related to PAT negotiations that don't include estimated increases in state funding from things like the state school fund and student investment accounts, which they said totals over $20 million per year. So in other words, the specifics get murky, but we are talking about millions of dollars.
Okay, that's a lot of money. $228 million is a lot of money. But Dirk, the state has a lot of money right now. You covered the revenue forecast in May, where economists delivered rather eye-popping news that the state had something like $2 billion more than what they expected to have. And during the legislative session, there was a lot of talk about how lawmakers were going to put a significant chunk of that money into the state's K-12 school budget. Did that happen?
It did. And let's just talk about school budgets for a second. School budgets in Oregon are kind of a conglomeration of several different sources. They are state general and lottery funds. That actually pays for the bulk of K through 12 schools, around 2/3 of the total budget. And then there are local property taxes that typically account for roughly 1/3 of the funding. And since 2019, there's also been another resource, this corporate activity tax that goes specifically towards schools as well in a number of different ways. So in the legislature, that first piece, the general fund allocation to schools, is always a hot ticket item. This year, Governor Tina Kotek sort of set off the conversation by proposing $9.9 billion into the state school fund with her proposed budget. That was about $600 million more than the last budget. So quite a bit more, but it was immediately decried by school officials who said they'd need to cut services if lawmakers put that much in. They were pushing for something like $10.3 billion, which they said would pay for sort of current service levels. Well, lo and behold, Lauren, the legislature in May, as you said, suddenly learned it had a lot more theoretical money to spend, money economists had come to expect would be in state coffers when all was said and done. And so lawmakers wound up getting a lot closer to what schools wanted. They put $10.2 billion into the state school fund. A lot of lawmakers, I think, presented that as a win.
Which is a very familiar narrative. It seems like most legislative sessions, the K-12 budget gets a lot of attention, and Democratic lawmakers often tout how much they're putting in the pot for schools as a win, while the unions often warn that it's not enough money. And it's sort of hard to navigate the truth, and this session was no different. So is this current strike proof that it was not enough money?
Well, that's right. I mean, at least for as long as I've been covering the legislature, it's the Dems say we've got the money for schools that we need to have. Often Republicans actually will try to throw a wrench in that, and they say, actually, you need to be doing far more, and we don't like some of the money you're putting into other places. And school boards and school unions, teachers unions believe always that more money is needed. And there is some data to back that up, which we can probably get to. But to your question, I think definitely the argument teachers and school districts are making right now is that 10.2 was not enough money, and this shows it. In the run-up to the strike, and then on Wednesday as the strike began, these officials were pretty unsparing in their assessment that this all could be avoided if lawmakers had sent more money their way. Here's Gary Hollins, who is the chair of the PPS school board, talking yesterday.
The excuse of we don't have more money is not acceptable. When we make things a priority, we find the money. So I think the state needs to find the money, come back in the session, and figure out how do we fund our most precious commodities, which is our children.
So that is very much what we're hearing from school officials today. But lawmakers you talk to sort of suggest this is, a bit of revisionist history. They point out that school officials like PPS Superintendent Guadalupe Guerrero testified in March, early in the year, that $10.3 billion, I know we're talking a lot of numbers, but $10.3 billion would be enough to satisfy their needs. And as I mentioned, lawmakers got close to that, and now Guerrero and others are placing blame squarely on the lawmakers. So that is not an argument that is winning over many of the Democrats who have a big role in education policy and funding. One thing that some of those folks do point out, though, is that they'd have a lot more money to spend and could solve this problem and probably many other problems if Oregon didn't have the kicker. The kicker, for folks that don't know or have forgotten, is this one-of-a-kind tax refund law that sends money back to taxpayers when personal income taxes come in higher than anticipated. And next year, it is going to be enormous, Lauren. $5.6 billion is heading back to taxpayers. A lot of Democrats these days, a lot of folks in general will tell you that money could pay for a lot of priorities.
That is a lot of money. That is a big kick.
Yeah.
I think one thing I want to mention, and just to take a step back for a moment, is that there was actually this one rare legislative session where people felt like both the unions and the lawmakers felt like school was going to be fully funded. And that was in 2019, when lawmakers passed what they said was a historic amount of school funding. They called it the Student Success Act. And it was supposed to invest more than $1 billion in early learning and K-12 every year. And it did that in large part by taxing businesses. It was not that long ago. How is the Student Success Act factoring in here?
Yeah, I can tackle that. You are right. It was a big game changer. That was a big conversation at the time. But as we know, one key thing happened between 2019 and now, which is COVID. It really changed the game. And part of that is students have significantly higher needs now, both, socially and emotionally, but also academically. And even in pockets of the state where there's lower enrollment and more staff, schools are still struggling. And so while this investment was historic, it's also important to remember that this funding is being tasked with making up for decades of inadequate funding, which, to Dirk's point earlier, I do think that that's what the PPS leaders are trying to draw attention to right now during the strike conversations. Oregon has never funded its K through 12 schools to the level its own quality education model suggests. And the QEM is supposed to kind of give a snapshot of how much would it cost to get schools to the point that we really want them to be at, not just to maintain our current services, but get it to a point of the type of education we want to provide. So for context, for the 2023-25 biennium, the QEM estimates the state would need a state school fund investment of about $13.2 billion. There are these kind of historic moments each step of the way. And the Student Success Act was kind of this big umbrella version of that. But we're also playing a lot of catch up in schools.
Yeah, the corporate activity tax, that business tax you're talking about, Lauren, has continued to bring in more and more money. That's something that Governor Tina Kotek actually pointed out this week when she was asked about some of these funding shortfalls and what the state was doing about it, that this money, it continues to grow. It's going towards schools. It's just kind of sad, actually, that this hugely hopeful moment that we covered, Lauren, in 2019, where, you had Peter Courtney and all these other, Arnie Roebland, all these other lawmakers who'd worked so long and said, I ran on funding schools. This is going to be this hugely historic moment. Now, all of a sudden, here we are 4 years later. A lot has happened, as Natalie mentioned, and we are just talking about how we are moribund in not funding schools again. And we have the first strike in Portland history. So that's where we are.
All right. Well, on that optimistic note, let's drop down to the local level. So once a K-12 budget is passed at the state level, bargaining starts happening at the local level. Natalie, what has this process been like at the local level?
Yeah, so negotiations in Portland specifically have been happening for the better part of a year. The last district union contract expired back in June, and state mediation began in August. And I believe the union said that they had met for 20 bargaining sessions or more by the time the strike actually began. So there's a lot of back and forth throughout that. And both sides have repeatedly said that the other isn't bargaining in good faith, that they aren't willing to meet the needs of the other. PPS leaders have said the proposals will result in massive cuts, and that in order to achieve the things that the PAT proposal is pushing for, they'd have to kind of do the opposite because of how many cuts they'd have to make. And as we mentioned earlier, districts across the state are dealing with similar financial issues. It's not just Portland. We are seeing this across the state. And we're also seeing union bargaining tensions growing in other parts of the state as well, Bend, Salem, Kaiser. So it's really happening all across the state at the local level.
What are the chances that lawmakers or Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler or the governor jump in here?
I mean, right now it seems pretty non-existent. These folks are right now sort of saying, union and district, you guys need to be talking and figure this out. And they're not doing a ton more that we can tell besides cheerleading. As I mentioned, I chatted with a number of majority Democrats in recent days who really offered just no hint, as I say, that they plan to come back to the table and pass new funding to sort of ease the strike or solve the strike as is being asked. There are a number of reasons for that. A big one is that dipping into state emergency funds or whatever funds to help solve this standoff would send a terrible message to the rest of the state, where, as Natalie mentioned, there are other districts that are at risk of teacher strikes. Democrats right now say they did their job. They found basically the amount of money that districts were asking for, and PPS and the teachers union need to figure out how to make it work. Governor Kotek made that point this week. She said this.
I'm not saying we have all the resources we need, and I expect our districts to figure it out. I expect them to prioritize in the classroom experience to get the results for our kids, because we will always have a funding challenge. That is not unusual. I need folks to stay at the table and figure it out.
On the local government level, we're also just not hearing any inkling that there might be help coming. And actually, there's an interesting precedent for something like that happening. In 2003, when Portland teachers were also on the verge of a strike, not quite there yet, the Portland City Council did step in. They raised business license fees, raised enough money to help sort of paper over the dispute, and there was no strike. But, Portland 20 years later, I don't have to tell you, Lauren, is a very different place. A lot of people think taxes are way too high. We've taxed for a lot of priorities in that time. There's a lot of worry about people actually leaving the city because taxes are too high. And so there just has been no appetite or move on the city or county's part to step into this strike.
With the caveat that we're just 2 days into this strike, what are the politics like out there in terms of public opinion? Is this popular? And what happens if it goes on for weeks?
At this point, there's a lot of public support. Recent polls show an overwhelming majority of Oregonians support teacher strikes in general, and thousands showed up on the picket lines for the first day yesterday or on Wednesday. Still, there are concerns about the loss of pay for educators during this time, the potential that health benefits could be taken away, the impact on kids long term. There's a lot of concerns among classified staff like paraeducators who are being tasked with getting last minute instruction on how to teach kids for reading coaching who need special attention during the strike, and them feeling like they're being put in a position where either the parents or the classified staff have to cross the picket line and not support the educators because of it. So there's a lot of conflict there, and it's possible that the overwhelming public support could shift at some point, but right now they're largely in support of the teachers. There's a mediation session scheduled for tomorrow on Friday. But if the strike continues, a lot could happen, a lot could change. And I think it will largely come down to, how stressed are the families getting who are having to provide childcare and activities and academics, the educators who are missing out on wages. I think it might just be a matter of time.
Just to take a step back here as we wrap up the podcast, the PPS strike is not happening in a vacuum. We're kind of in this age of the strike. Contracts are either ending or bargaining is occurring across so many industries, right as we put the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic behind us.
I mean, that's right. We've just come off of so-called hot labor summer, as some called it. It hasn't really seemed to dissipate. There was this major strike by Hollywood writers. Actors are on strike. The United Auto Workers just struck in the big three automakers and won some major concessions. So that looked really successful to a lot of folks. Locally here, healthcare workers are striking or talking about strikes. Organized labor is restive, I think, at this moment in time, and that is playing out across the country, as you note.
Yeah, and I would say that in terms of PAT in Portland, I do think they're taking note of the successes of other teacher strikes and strikes in other industries. When the districts, Camas and Evergreen up in Washington earlier this year, got more of what they wanted after striking, Portland teachers told me that they saw that as a positive sign that a strike here could move the needle when they haven't been able to do that in negotiations. And I think that seems to be the public sentiment as well. I've talked with some parents who they see this as a learning opportunity for their kids to see, kind of civic involvement. They want them to learn what it looks like for you to advocate for yourself. So most of the people I've talked to are like, yeah, we didn't want to reach a point where we had to strike, but we're going to, and it's the tool that we have in our arsenal right now. And I think other districts who are kind of on the precipice of this, I think they're going to see Portland as an example that, they could follow because Portland did it. Maybe we could do it here too.
Well, this is certainly an issue that we'll continue to track daily, but let's leave this conversation here for today. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
This week's episode was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We will be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.